So Guy, what did you get out of today's discussion?
Well, I think I got several messages really. One was that there's not a great deal of optimism around that the Doha round is going to be completed, certainly not by the target date and maybe not at all. Secondly, there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens next, if it either fails or just simply goes into a coma. But thirdly, the differences are all between the same players, as are the differences in the G20, in the Copenhagen climate negotiations, and indeed in other forums. And I think what that tells us is that the problems that have arisen in the Doha round are not confined to the WTO. Of course, there are certain particular things about the trade system that make them appear in a different form, in a special form in the WTO. But what we face is basically a very difficult transition from a world in which we had a multilateral system that was run by a hegemon, the United States, a paradoxical state of affairs. You need to have an all-powerful nation in order to produce a system that creates balance and stability and a degree of fair play between everybody. We're losing that, perhaps we lost it some time ago, and we don't really know what sort of framework will govern future international relations. Certainly we do know, I think, that it will not be the same set of circumstances as those in which the US basically ran the world.
So your view of a plan B, should Doha fail, isn't quite put together yet?
Well, Plan B really goes to the negotiations themselves. That's a more specific question. Is there an agenda? Are there areas of common interest between certain players? Could you perhaps change the negotiating procedures to make them more flexible? Those are all very much specific to the WTO players. But I think that even if you did have a Plan B that allowed for the continuation of the round in some form, the best you could hope for would be an extremely modest outcome that would avoid the worst rather than an optimal outcome that would have far-reaching impact not only on market access but of course also on the rules of the world trade system.
Guy de Jonquière, thanks very much. So Sheila, let's be realistic about the future prospects for Doha. What are your thoughts?
I think in terms of getting a settlement on the basis of the current agenda, there are no prospects at all. It's too late. It is the agenda of 1999 in the first place. The idea of trying to get the light parts of Doha agreed isn't going to work because countries have to put to their, literally to their parliaments and figuratively to their people, something important, something substantial in order to show first that we've actually achieved something in the last 8 years, but also that it's worth making whatever sacrifices we have to make as part of a settlement. So a settlement has to be big enough to matter. It has to be big enough for people in the countries to be lobbying for it. What's on the table now probably isn't big enough to matter, but it's too big to go through on the nod. So it's neither achievable nor good enough.
So would you say there's a lack of political incentive as well as political will?
There's always been that. You have to remember this is the round that started by accident. It started because there were 2 or 3 things still on the agenda and because the world had to show real union in the face of 9/11. Doha was 2 months after that. It was not a round that happened because some type of business really wanted it, and every other round has started for that reason. So there was never really a grand bargain to be done.
Do you have a view of what a plan B might look like should Doha fail?
I think what has to be done is to recognize first that the WTO itself has very important functions which go on with or without a round, and I find it very sad that people assume that if a round fails, that means the WTO has failed. No, a round is incidental to the WTO from that point of view. But we will need another negotiation. There are starting to emerge the sort of issues which people will really want to solve. It hasn't happened yet. It won't happen probably for another 2 or 3 years until some of the regional groups come into conflict, some of the conflicts between trade policy and climate policy start to appear, and some of the larger countries like Brazil and China become even more interested in getting access. Then we'll have the traditional ingredients for a successful round of lots of interest groups in lots of countries who want something from each other. Then you can talk.
Sheila Page, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
So Vicky, what are your views from a business perspective on the future prospects for the Doha round?
But I think most businesses want to be able to do as much trade as they possibly can. And clearly the WTO and the Doha round would be really important for them if it is concluded in the right way. But it's likely that it isn't going to be. I mean, the trouble is that we're having a number of bilaterals and perhaps also some agreements which involve more than one country. But for businesses which are trying to export or do business or invest or whatever it is that they're trying to do, what you do find is that there's huge confusion as to what rules work here. What are the sort of country of origin type restrictions that are there? Are they equivalent everywhere? All that sort of stuff, which we've just been talking with some lawyers who say it's very, very difficult because everything changes, of course, all the time. And trying to explain to businesses what the actual regulations are tends to be very, very difficult. So, of course, if we have a multilateral system where rules are very simple and they apply to everyone, then that's easily understood. And you can make your plans in a way that really leads to the results that you want.
Do you have any thoughts of what a plan B might look like should Doha fail?
Well, that plan B would be very, very difficult. It is to accept, I would imagine, that we have to look at it in a different way, that compromises will have to be reached somehow to ensure that China, over a period of time, starts really becoming much more involved in all this in a sort of leading position. But is there going to be the will to really work at this? There are so many, unfortunately, sort of domestic political issues, with the US, presidential elections coming up and so on, what's going on in Europe right now, continuous concerns about the imbalances that are there on the trade front, that I suspect that, in fact, there isn't going to be that much impetus to do anything very much at all. And that leaves, really, the whole world trade system in a bit of a sort of abeyance, because we just don't know what might follow from this. And again, that matters hugely for business and for growth in the economy. The good thing is that despite everything, trade has continued to grow since the recession that we saw a couple of years ago. It has been expanding quite significantly. It's been hit, of course, by all sorts of political things that have been going on in the Middle East and elsewhere, but nevertheless, there is a momentum there. And that will continue, and in some ways, that in itself is going to provide, I think, quite a lot of willingness to do something about ensuring that there is greater openness and agreements, at least, so that at least trade can continue to flow. So I think it will happen naturally in any way, but it would be a great shame if we don't move to achieving a system which gives you the guarantee, if you like, that you can export anywhere, whether it's goods or services. And I'm really worried that actually a plan B is going to be such a suboptimal situation for us to be in, that it's just not going to lead to anything fantastic.
So you think that even if Doha fails, the prospects for global growth and for globalization more broadly will still proceed as before?
Well, there will continue to be growth inevitably, whatever happens to Doha, because after all, we have seen it anyway, unless there is some other huge sort of problem that we face, like the financial crisis we had before. Yes, growth will be there, and trade tends to lead growth in an interesting way. I mean, if you actually look at the correlations between trade and GDP, they're very, very closely linked. And it will happen, but it's not going to happen the way it should happen, because in reality, we should be able to see production moving to, obviously, the places where it's more competitive, and trade happening in a way that actually increases GDP for everyone. So we are going to be in a suboptimal situation, whether we like it or not. And it's interesting to think what could be, or could have been, the growth that we could have had in the world economy with a proper trade round. And we're not going to get that.
Can you see a world where the WTO is central, but without the accompanying trade rounds?
Well, it's interesting to see what WTO has done so far. I mean, clearly it has affected perceptions, and it has been a force for good, because the tariffs have been reduced and all that sort of stuff has been going on in any case over a period of time. And if you look at some of the things that are going on, even on the services side, you can argue that things are generally improving. So you could argue that you still have a WTO without necessarily it being heavily involved in a proper trade round, because it can do all sorts of other things. It can facilitate what's going on in terms even of the regional trade agreements that are taking place. It can still be there in terms of dispute resolutions, which is really, really important, because who else is going to be doing it? And it seems to work, even though it takes quite some time for any decisions to come forward. But at least it's there, and people are worried about it. hopefully they will continue to be worried about it, even without another trade round. And so that is important. I think it has to be there. Abandoning it, I think, is going to send a very, very bad message. And if there's nothing there to replace it, then I think we'll be in a much worse state than if it's there, whatever happens to the trade round.
Vicky Price, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.